Thank you very much, yeah, again for the invitation. It would have been so great to meet you in Edinburgh last year, but then life has its way to somehow remind us that our planning and our systems are more often than not delusional, I guess. But then there are so many nice faces here, some I haven't seen in a long time, some I wish I would have met. So it's still a great opportunity, and it has been a consistent communication in organization. So thank you for doing this hard work. Today I'll be talking about mainly around my last book, which was published, in a collection which is somehow quite tightly linked with the Spalding conference. And again, I don't know if he is here right now, but I would have liked to thank Brian Black for having made this possible. You see kind of a quick progression of the discussion I plan to go on. It seems like a lot, but actually I plan to end a bit earlier, hopefully in time, so that we perhaps have more time to discuss and debate. I think personally that's what I would prefer, but I'll give you an overview, right, of what's in there with a few more things that are not in there. So the kind of text which preoccupy me within the next few pages are those Sanskrit writings which appear as philosophical digests, summarizing the arguments of various schools of thought on key points of debate. I call them doxographies. My talk reflects back on that crucial categorical choice which determined my overall doctoral research. It explains why I consider the label doxography to be an appropriate designation for the texts on which I worked. It spells out my research, how my research endeavored to bring forth a new critical perspective on a literary genre often denigrated by philosophers. While doing so, I engaged with a relevant piece of scholarship, which I have unfortunately failed to include in my thesis, that of Pierre-Julien Harter. Moreover, I reframed some of the critical points of my book on dialogue and doxography around the notion of doxography and spiritual exercises. In this way, this talk offers a condensed version of the theoretical framework I use to analyze my Sanskrit materials within my last work. Now, to begin with, for those who are not familiar with doxography, I'll align just a few points of what is a doxography, right? So I would say a doxography is either a whole text or a part of a text where competing views of philosophers or schools are presented, following a division of topics organized into sets and subsets within specific differences, to which a name label is attached in most cases, where the original argumentative supports of such view may or may not be given, where the author's own view and arguments may or may not be criticized, where the content consists either in literal or in non-literal rendering of sources, and perhaps more importantly for my analysis, where the overall concern is primarily systematic, dialectic, with little or no historiographical character. So within Indian doxographies, systematizers are breaking down the doctrinal contents of competing schools of Indian thought into more or less coherent topical lists. Through them, the Indian philosophical world itself is made to appear as a somewhat coherent list. We hear of 6 or more philosophical schools, generally referred to as darshanas, literally referring to an established view, an authoritative opinion, shared by a certain community. To me, this does not primarily refer to a network of authors. Here, I mean, darshana do not primarily refer to a network of authors, although these are undoubtedly the systematizers and promoters of darshanas, but rather, as in doxography, darshana concretely is an architecture of a finely organized topical list, structuring different schemes of reasoning designed to convey specific cognitive products. These cognitive structures interact with one another to form as coherent an identity as needed by a given religious community. They tend to vary according to given socio-historical context, but are generally presented in literature as quasi-eternal truth, like padattas or tattvas, for obvious rhetorical reason. For example, the doxographical literature dealing with various darshanas typically present them as ideal abstractions given all at once by some authority, sometimes referred to as apta or devata, and not as a historical product. These doxographical lists have shaped the way we talk of Indian philosophy, but one should not mistake the aesthetic depiction of the Indian philosophical realm found in doxographies with the actual complex socio-historical puzzle in which Indian philosophy actually developed. These texts, I argue, are designed to inform an aesthetic exercise of thought formation and transformation, which I theorize as a spiritual exercise. In doxography, as in ritual, sharp categorical oppositions are negotiated by an informed perspective, a certain vision of order, which organizes the world in strings of symbolic reasoning. As classicists have noted, dialectic is the Sitzleben of doxography, or its position, or its purpose in life. I am not the only one to have taken notice of the dialectical nature of the doxographical materials found in and around the Indic cultural milieu. Similar reflections have been made before me by Pierre-Julien Harter while discussing the Tibetan Drupta genre. Though he does not discuss dialectic explicitly, Harter suggests or argues that this discriminative nature is in fact what makes doxography interesting from a philosophical point of view, while it is generally disappointing from a historical perspective. He explained that in Tibetan doxography, a genre which developed out of previous Indic material, now to quote him, the treatment of the schools are partial ones and could even be interpreted as historical distortions. This partiality may be damaging from a historical point of view, but it is not so from a philosophical point of view. The specific interest of a philosophical approach is not the opinion or position of some individual or group as such, which is justifiably the focus of a history of ideas. Rather, what is at stake is what should be considered to be right or true about a specific topic that is addressed universally. By universality, I mean the mode through which an issue can be analyzed, elaborated, and given an answer, or even solved, abstracted from its mere historical contingent conditions. A universal treatment should be capable of being transferred to other times and places without losing its power to make sense. In brief, Harter argues that the peculiar dialectic he encounters within the Drupta sources is one where truth is distinguished among a range of possible options or views concerning a given topic. These texts, he suggests, work in abstraction of historical reality to rather focus on universal principles valid beyond temporal contingencies. It is in this sense that according to him, according to Harter, they can be considered to be genuinely philosophical since they seek to establish truth. He says, the elimination of all schools but one necessarily leads to a true position, even if this position is only provisionally true before being itself considered as a framework for a new question. Harter and I agree on the dialectical nature of the different doxographical sources we engage with. We both see our sources as presenting genuine philosophical exercises, what I insist on further by theorizing such practices as spiritual exercises in tune with Pierre Hadot's work. Where Harter and I slightly disagree concerns the use of the label doxography to denote such a literature. Harter perpetuates an understanding of the doxographical genre initially articulated by idealist philosophers in the 19th century. For example, he observes that generally doxographies were digests providing the tenets of a school or of an individual philosopher, the conclusion of or dead thought, as Hegel would say, since the life of the thinking process was missing and only the inanimate results were given. In a sense, we could say that they were no more and maybe no less philosophical than is a dictionary of philosophy from A to Z. I am also aware of such readings of doxography entertained in similar Western philosophical scholarship. One of the most succinct expressions of this view is that formulated by Jorge G. A. Grazia. The latter plainly stated what is commonly expected of the Western doxographer. He says, the main characteristic shared by all doxographical approaches is their emphasis on uncritical description. In contrast with the more probing and critical character of the polemical approaches, doxography aims to present views and ideas in a descriptive fashion without aiming to evaluate them critically. Indeed, in keeping with its historical emphasis, doxography often discourages interpretation. Influenced by similar ideas, Harter is hesitant to refer to his Drupta text as doxographies. He says, I am proposing 2 points for consideration. First, the term doxography may not be the best term to translate Drupta. Other genres of Greek literature may better map onto the Tibetan Gupta. Second, interpreting certain Tibetan texts from the perspective of doxography may prevent us from seeing the philosophical significance of those texts. This is why I will use the phrase school denomination rather than the phrase doxographical categories. Now, to me, whether the other genre of Greek literature share similar features with the Gupta materials does not preclude the term doxography from being a skillful designation of such texts, given that one defines the genre in a way which reflects its most probing feature in relation to the materials one studies. Harter's second point is more interesting to me. He suggests that merely referring to a text as being doxographical may discredit its philosophical worth in the eyes of philosophers. Hence, to avoid displeasing the crowd, Harter bows to old habits and avoids the designation of doxography altogether, preferring the no less problematic concept of school denomination. On my part, I believe it to be most useful to challenge the idealist reading of doxography, especially knowing that this interpretation is out of touch with state-of-the-art research in the field of philological studies of classical doxographies, for example, started by Mansfeld and Runia since 1997, have consistently shown that various ancient doxographical texts adopt a dialectical structure similar to that devised by Aristotle himself, and thus were not intended as purely descriptive or historiographical accounts. Hence, I would rather dispute the philosophers' views on doxography instead of reinforcing their prejudices toward a literature and sometimes toward the people for which they have little understanding. After all, doxography was not the only domain where Hegel has shown a peculiar aptitude to denigrate what he did not understand. Concerning Indian thought in general, for example, he could not help but see it as mere child's play, fantastic, subjective, wild, dreamy, frenzied, absurd, and repetitive. I do not see any substantial reason to perpetuate such an unhelpful reasoning. On the contrary, I consider it to be of utmost importance for the future of philosophical inquiry to refute such prejudices once and for all. Beside the labeled issue, the name doxography, Harter's project and mine have much in common. His interest lies in pointing out the philosophical substance of his sources. Now I will quote him again. He says, I want to show that school denomination can function as more than just labels for classifying opinions and are used for purposes beyond the desire to create a worldview or order. They also participate in authentic philosophical inquiries. Using school denomination is a way to situate one's own philosophical position and not just as a way to categorize other people's opinions. Using school denominations as a way to map the possible answer of a philosophical problem and to enclose the totality of the problem within a logical frame enables one to navigate through possible solutions to find the one that responds accurately to the problem, to find one that is necessarily true. We can allow the text to speak to us in the present, where speaking means causing us to fundamentally question our own conception and behaviors. It is the only way that these texts can be meaningful with regard to truth and falsehood. Harter stresses here the authentic philosophical inquiries articulated in his Tibetan sources. He suggests that by using school denominations, which I would rather read as doxographical schemes, to identify the best philosophical position on a given topic, they cause the student to fundamentally question his or her conception and behaviors. It is precisely this kind of self-reflection triggered by theological schemes, the structural rhetoric of doxographies, which I argue constitutes the spiritual exercises of doxography, at least within the text I studied. I borrow the expression spiritual exercises from the historian of classical philosophy, Pierre Hadot, who was directeur d'études at the l'École pratique des hautes études and professor at the Collège de France. By moving away from a historiographical reading of doxographical materials, and by rather insisting on their dialectical nature, I suggest that the point of Indian doxography is primarily transformative, even before being informative. Indian doxography as a spiritual exercise adopts different dialectical forms, dependent on the sectarian filiation in which it is embedded, for example. My research has highlighted 3 different dialectical forms. It is essential in order to understand the dialogical dynamic of Indian doxographies to firmly establish each of them or each of these forms in its dialogical soil. Only then can their doxographical scheme reveal its full pedagogic and psychagogic value. Uprooted from their doctrinal sectarian context, doxographies are literally insignificant. The analysis of each of the 3 doxographies I studied sought to elucidate the dialectical teleology through which each doxographer is guiding his students towards the adoption of right view or samyak darshana. In doing so, the authors engage each student in a process of conversion and confirmation, depending on one's initial station within the mandala of views, a symbolic disposition of views, if you want. In that sense, doxographies can engage with a broad array of students of different capacities. Only by establishing the right view indicated by the doxographer can a student's view move from its conventional status to the position of truth, the ultimate perspective. This is the ultimate outcome of the spiritual exercise of doxography, I suggest. My research looked at the earliest doxographies of Madhyamaka Buddhism, Jainism, and Advaita Vedanta to highlight three dialectical teleologies, one peculiar to each tradition. By organizing philosophical views in these specific patterns, doxographies manage to both level a certain criticism of the doctrinal content of each darshana and to establish a dialectical path to right view, to samyak darshana. Each teleology reproduces a dialectical attitude which can be traced back to the narrative forms and pedagogies of its specific tradition. This should come as no surprise, since these dialectical methods, by conveying specific propedeutic to truth, characterize the spiritual identity of each tradition, their own conception of the way to go about cultivating liberative knowledge. It is only natural that Indian doxographies display idiosyncrasies in tune with their respective worldview. For Madhyamaka Buddhism, I showed how the dialectic of no view underpins the thematic progression of Bhaviveka's Madhyamaka Hridaya Karika, directing its dialectical teleology. The first three chapters of the whole text form a single dialectical unit. It establishes the author's perspective through a negation of Abhidharma categories. Thereafter, every succeeding doctrine is refuted in a movement going from the most acceptable position, from a Madhyamaka perspective, to the most problematic one, leaving the Mimamsa view at the extreme end of a downward spiral into absurdity. This reductio ad absurdum of world philosophy is typical of Madhyamaka dialectics. Bhaviveka's dialectical model in the MHK can be said to be a declining teleology, a fall away from truth. The ultimate perspective is first provisionally established through the corrective negation of the most acceptable conventional standpoint. From there on, Bhaviveka continues to grind to pieces all other mundane views. This brief presentation of the MHK's dialectical strategy now leads me to address a slight criticism towards another piece of scholarship, which I could not engage in my thesis due to its later publication, that of Jan Westerhof's interpretation of Bhaviveka's doxographical strategy, formulated in his excellent monography, The Golden Age of Indian Buddhism. Overall, Westerhof's treatment of Bhaviveka's doxographical work is helpful. I seek here to stop upon only one detail where he argues that one key aim of such doxographic treatise was to establish a doxographical hierarchy, that is, to set out different schools in ascending order of truth. This idea mirrors the early Buddhist distinction between sutras with interpretable meaning, neyartha, and those that did not need to be interpreted but could be taken literally, nitartha. Applied to doxographies, this distinction entails that different doctrines are not described as a set of varying wrong views that differ from the one correct view the author wants to defend. Instead, they are arranged in a hierarchy with the view to be defended at the top. My only concern with this passage is to the effect that, as I just explained, if we look further, well, I just explained that actually in Bhaviveka, the best position is actually not at the end, but right at the beginning. And that way there is indeed a hierarchy and a top position, but the latter is found at the beginning and not at the end. And as an opposite, for example, to the Advaita model, which I will present in a moment. Thus, the MHK is particularly interesting exactly because it employs a different teleological model than the most common pyramidal ones used in ancient doxographies. It is an inverted pyramid of sort. Instead of an ascension toward truth, it offers a descent into absurdity. This, I argue, is in tune with the general rhetoric of the no view and the distinguishing reductio ad absurdum methodology that one finds in Madhyamaka school. Now to come back to the Jaina sources. So for Haribhadra's Darshana Samuchaya, its dialectical model, I argue, is one of equipoise. For the followers of the Jaina Marga is the axis mundi of philosophy. It is Madhyastha, meaning that it stands in the middle, right? Presents a middle way. The Jaina path developed all necessary conceptual tools to abide by this salutary middle way and the purifying ascetic discipline suited to remove obscuring karmas. Through the Shadarshana Samuchaya, Haribhadra engages his students in a propedeutic to truth. This dialectical training revolves within the conceptual realm. Nonetheless, it gravitates towards the non-conceptual axis of truth, the ultimate reality, using heterodoxy as a training ground for engaging in a multiplex, anekanta if you want, soteriological method designed to lay the foundation of omniscience. In the end, views are mere perspective. Only in that sense can they be equal. However, the superior perfect vision, the Samyak Darshana of the omniscient one, the Jina, which is discussed exactly in the middle of the list of views enumerated within the HDS, is not bound to them. It is no mere view. Though the text seems to objectively present each view in an egalitarian manner, its subtle rhetoric clearly indicates that the Jaina middle way, revealed by the virile Jaina, is the only superior omnivision. Now let's have a look at the Advaita source I looked at. When it comes to Pseudo-Shankara's Sarvasiddhanta Sangrahas, where every view negates the preceding, ever progressing upwards towards the throning Advaita Vedanta position, the dialectical model is a gradual ascension. Every further step on the stairway to enlightenment broadens the previous perspective. It is a movement towards the overarching truth of Advaita, the worldly expression of which can only be found within scriptures, acting as fingers pointing at the moon of ultimate truth. The journey is said to culminate in pure Brahman, where all views, all singulars subside in the one general category, the only being, Sat if you want, the cosmic axis mundi. Perhaps one could talk of the Advaita methodology as a dialectical movement from the particular to the universal, using doxographical categories as instantiation of necessary particulars to be dissolved as they are outgrown by a wider truth. They are necessary only in the sense that they present various stages of ignorance found among worldlings, and most importantly, in oneself. Appearing as a general model of thought, they serve as skillful pedagogy. Yeah? In practice, the SSS contributes to a rediscovery of one's true nature, pure consciousness, if you want, right? And this ultimate state does not exist among the views listed in text and debated by scholars. Now that we have seen these three different strategies, these three different teleology, I would like to share a little experience I had once, a thought that came to me that actually showed that this way, this kind of dialectical and rhetorical approach is not only something we find in ancient literature, is actually commonly found in marketing, right? So I give you an example. A few years back, I was with my wife in Dublin. We went to visit the Jameson whiskey distillery. And well, they gave us a lovely tour. And by the end of that tour, we were allowed to have a degustation of 3 different whiskeys. And I thought that was quite clever and well organized. So what they did is they gave us first a red label whiskey to taste, then a Jameson whiskey, and then a Jack Daniel's whiskey. And then with these 3, if you want, 3 categories, these 3 schools of whiskey making, we were given slight details about them. And I will just summarize. For example, it was told that red label is quite good, but is expensive in comparison to Jameson, which is also excellent, but rather cheap. And Jack Daniel is cheap and bad. So here we can see that the old rhetoric actually kind of reflects Harry Badra's strategy, perhaps in that sense that it is, the Jameson is placed in the middle, and one participating in that degustation come to that understanding that we should rather buy Jameson than any of the other competitors. Now, I find that example quite funny somehow. When I told that to my wife at the degustation, she was rather puzzled that I was so nerd as to think of my doctoral work instead of enjoying the whiskeys. Now, a few last words. So my research thus presented 3 different theological models structuring the overall rhetoric of Indian doxographies. So that the Madhyamika model presented the best view at the beginning of its list. The Jaina model opted for a middle position, a Madhyastha, while the Advaita assumed the final position. This by no means indicates that each tradition consistently perpetuated these models. It is not the case. The most common model of doxography I have seen thus far, regardless of sectarian filiation, is in fact the pyramidal ascending hierarchy represented here by the Advaitin SSS. This diversity of model is nonetheless worthy of notice. It appears to be unique to India. When I presented these findings to classicists at the Munich conference, Received Opinion, Doxography in Antiquity and the Islamic World, during a question period, none had ever heard of any other model than the ascending pyramidal one. The idea that doxographical dialectic may constitute a form of spiritual exercise in its own right was also novelty. This confirmed my intuition to the effect that a better understanding of the nature and function of Indian doxography could lead to a reappraisal of the genre worldwide. Thus, it is an idea I now propose to study further to the notion of list and list making in Indian philosophy. On this, I thank you for your attention.